Hey guys, it's Judy from Nutrition with Judy. Thanks for joining me today. While you're here, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the red button. If you're listening on podcast, please make sure to leave a review. This allows my content to get in front of more people. Today, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Joanne Ozug. Joanne is a carnivore podcaster. I was looking under carnivore podcast and I ran into Joanne's podcast. And as I got to know a little bit more about her journey, it was really quite fascinating. If you haven't heard of her podcast, it's called The Road to Carnivore. I highly recommend it. It has like 10 to 15 minute short clips about different aspects of carnivore, why fiber is not necessarily beneficial for you, why certain fats are beneficial. It's very short, bite-sized ways to understand more about the carnivore diet. And it's very informative, educational, and she presents it in a great way. So I will link to that in the show notes, but make sure to check that out. So Joanne used to be an online food blogger. She was very successful. And so it's quite interesting learning about her backstory. She, I think, was on several news channels and media outlets, and she was quite popular, but she decided to give up a lot of that to share her story and advocate for a meat-only carnivore diet. In our conversation, Joanne shares a lot about her healing journey and why she just couldn't do what she used to do and why she decided to just change her career and give up a thriving, successful business. When I heard Joanne's story, I could relate so much. I was also on trajectory in my management consulting days to become partner over a certain amount of time. And that was my life vision for my career. And everything changed when I got really sick. And then I started learning about nutrition and my world really was rocked. When you are sick and you change and you heal from something, you realize the depths of how much you want this for others. And when you are a very community oriented person, you want this information to be out there. After I healed so much, I wanted to shout out my healing to the world so that no one else has to be sick ever again. As you hear Joanne's story, you'll realize how much meat only has changed her life and for the better, and how it's just changed the trajectory of her life. Let's get right into the interview. Hey, Joanne, it's so good to finally sit with you in person or on a computer screen in person and chat with you. I know we've been chatting offline a lot. I love a lot of the work you're doing. I love your podcast. It's these short bits of nutritional information that's very heartfelt and honest. And there's also scientific backing. So I think that's really helpful. I will put all of that in the show notes so that people can check out your podcast. But for those of the people listening and watching that may not know you, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I'm excited to have this conversation. I feel like your stuff is very heart-centered. And I'm all about that too. So I guess before I get into my carnivore story, I will say first that I never ever thought I would be doing this. Before carnivore, food was really the center of my life. It was, I was always a foodie. My career was always revolved around food, the business that I built. And even in my personal life, food was kind of my answer to everything. If I was feeling happy and wanted to celebrate, food. If I was stressed and wanted to annihilate that emotion, food. If I was bored, food. I had a really strong attachment to food from a young age. And so carnivore really came about kind of unexpectedly and kind of by accident and totally turned my life upside down. So about 6 months after I gave birth to my second child, I was dealing with some really severe bleeding and constipation. Hemorrhoids and constipation, that's really common during pregnancy, but even long after delivery, it just kept carrying on and getting worse. And at the time, I had totally bought into the plant-based health narrative in food. And most of what I was eating was kale salads and raw vegetables and drinking lots of green juice because I thought that would bring me healing and health. And I remember being frustrated, like it just kept getting worse to the point where I needed to have surgery because the bleeding was so bad that it looked like I was menstruating, but I was not. It was just agonizingly painful. And I was on YouTube one day and I saw a video on carnivore. I don't know why I clicked it, but I clicked it and I watched it and I thought, this seems completely insane. And also, this also kind of makes sense. And so I decided, I didn't tell anybody except for my husband, but it's like, I'm going to try this. And within 3 days, my bleeding was gone. Bleeding that had been going on for over a year. And not only that, but all these chronic health issues that I had been dealing with my whole life. Severe acid reflux is one of those things. I had had an endoscopy for it, colonoscopy, taken all sorts of medications. And where we ended up with it, I was just told you'd have to manage this the rest of your life. And I have a list of like 30 things that, Carnivore has put into remission. But so that was really weird. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance happening. And then 2 weeks in, I fell off the wagon. It wasn't planned. I went to a birthday party and I couldn't resist some of the food, and the bleeding started again immediately. And that night I decided I'm going to double down. I'm going to do this for at least a few months. And it was just the craziest thing, because I had never, ever experienced health like that before. And looking back, of course I didn't, because I grew up eating Pop-Tarts and Hot Pockets and Capri Sun. So I never knew what health felt like.
Right.
And toward the end of that, I kind of had to make a choice. And, I said in the beginning, I had this business that I'd built. I was the breadwinner for my family. That business, as a food blogger, recipe developer, brand spokesperson, supported my family. But I just knew that I wanted to choose health. I wanted to choose carnivore. And that sort of forced me to figure out how I would work through some of those emotional hangups, those mental, emotional obstacles, because I really wanted to make it work. And the thing that's been so beautiful, the point where I'm at now, where I'm approaching 2 years of doing this, is that carnivore gave me the most incredible physical healing. And that's really why I started it. But there has been kind of a deeper, more profound secondary layer of healing that carnivore has given me. I really love to talk about, I talk about all the sciencey stuff on my podcast, but where my heart really is the mental, emotional piece, because that was such a big part of my journey. And, I like to talk about stress eating. I would define that as this normalized practice where we use food to temporarily escape a negative emotion. The kicker being that negative emotion is just trying to inform us of a need. It's trying to tell us something. And I felt this was true for myself. And I think it's true for most people. I don't think people really want to be buffering and numbing with food. It's just that we're not really taught how to handle and process those negative emotions. Right. And so it's just been this really beautiful thing where carnivore, it gave me that physical healing, and it gives you that setup where you're not eating any addictive food. So it kind of protects you in that sense. And it kind of forces you to look at some of your food behaviors and just those very unique mental, emotional hurdles. So that's kind of my story, and why I love carnivore so much, because it's healed me just beyond my initial hopes and expectations. So yeah. I love it.
I love that story. I mean, it's similar to my story, actually, of wanting to heal and then figuring out that, whoa, this is also helping with my eating disorder. And I think that's a lot of the beauty of a zero carb or meat only carnivore diet, is the fact that once you are healing a lot of the physical issues, you just notice like, wait, I have less brain fog. I have less cravings, and my mental health is just lifting, where I'm not struggling with as much anxiety or depression. And then even if you deal with those things, let's say on a carnivore diet, you realize, oh, wow, I've been band-aiding with food for so long and I didn't realize that. And now that I'm having a hard day, I'm struggling with my food choices. And that's when we realize, well, maybe you also struggle with disordered eating or a poor relationship with food, where we cope with food, right? At a young age, we have baby is crying, we feed the baby milk. And I think we have always coped and celebrated and mourned with food. And a lot of people only think that food is a poor relationship when people are defined as having an eating disorder. But I think there's a lot of reason why people become obese or struggle with weight, because we don't even think about it. And emotionally, we turn to food to cope, to escape. And when you eat a meat only diet, you have to face the music, because you no longer have the foods to turn to cope. And I think a lot of the people that, like, you have been blessed to acknowledge that and be aware of it. But I'll work with clients that will say, I'm struggling with cravings. And I really think it's because sometimes they cave into the stress of that emotion and they haven't changed their struggles, or they haven't found a new habit. And so they go back to the food. So in your situation, for example, in those moments where you used to turn to food, like, what have you done to now alleviate yourself from turning to carbs and foods that are less than ideal?
Yeah. So there's so much there. I actually episodes 15 and 16 of my podcast. I have how to handle cravings and how to handle falling off the wagon. There's like a certain series of steps that I will literally go back to those episodes and walk myself through. I've kind of changed my mindset where, I talked about those negative emotions. I realized I almost felt like a lunatic when I first realized this, but they're not fun. But at the same time, they actually are a gift because they kind of shine a light on what it is that you really need. If you hate your job, for example, and you come home and you're numbing with popcorn and chocolate, like you're adding health problems and you do absolutely nothing about your work situation. And I know you love root cause healing. That's not really a root cause solution. Right. What I really love about the negative emotions and welcoming them and listening to them is you can actually figure out what you need to do to make your life better so that you don't even need to, numb with those foods. But usually I have a process, first I figure out, am I actually hungry? There have been times when I thought I was having a craving. It's like, well, I'm actually willing to eat like a cold chicken breast out of the fridge with salt. So actually I'm hungry. But if I'm not willing to do that, I realize, okay, this is an emotional thing. And something that I got in the habit of doing is really training myself to figure out from just like an honest but neutral place, like what is the package deal of that slice of cake? Like, yes, I will get these 5 minutes of pleasure while eating it, but I also know that I will sleep horribly and have hot flashes that night. I know they'll probably have diarrhea within like 30 minutes of eating it. I'll get horrible acid reflux, weight gain, and I really I think before I used to see a piece of cake and just see the pleasure, the 5-minute pleasure. And that shift has really helped me because I'm totally allowed to eat the cake. It's just that there's kind of like a more of an ownership of what it is. And that has really helped me even get to this place now where people are always a little surprised when I say this, but I think so many of us have diet mentality. I certainly did. I started dieting in middle school and someone will come up to me at a party, be like, oh, do you want a cupcake? Oh, wait, I forgot. You can only eat meat. And it's like, no, I can eat that. I can eat cupcakes every meal, every day for the rest of my life. Like I choose to eat meat. Like it's from a place of freedom and really understanding the consequences. So I think that's a great thing. Like a lot of people just don't even view it that way and it can just shift so much.
I think that's beautiful. The fact that you're saying it's actually freedom to just eat meat, because I see a lot of people say, okay, I'll give up the carbs. I'll give up this. I'll give up that. I can't eat that, right? So the words that we use to define how we're eating a meat-only diet is so important, especially because one is coming from a place of I'm empowered and I choose to only eat meat versus the other way is, well, I can't eat that because it'll make me sick or I'm not allowed to eat that. And so the words matter because a lot of times we are thinking so many thoughts in a day and we're not even aware of it. And so when we are viewing carbohydrates or certain foods as something that we are not permitted to eat rather than you choose not to eat, those then will affect you when you are, again, in a place of stress or coping. And then you may want to turn to those foods because, again, it's like, I don't care about these permissions. Like, I'm just going to do whatever I want when you're rebelling. But if you think of it as I'm choosing not to eat those things, then it might just be a little bit easier. And I think it's really important. You mentioned that you were, in the public space. I consider yourself a celebrity chef. So how did you do that change? I cannot imagine that, like you mentioned, cognitive dissonance. I think that would be like a nice way of putting it, but it's almost like your whole world is crashing in front of you. How did you pivot? Did you just change your career? Like how did you, were you still a chef when you became carnivore? And like, how did that all happen?
Yeah. So I've been in the food industry for a long time, really my whole adult life. And, it's really interesting because definitely toward the end, I started to see kind of that plant-based narrative really take over the industry. And I kind of bought into that as well. 4 years before Carnivore, I did a Whole30. It's like a paleo elimination diet. And I was at this conference and a friend told me about it. I actually did it for weight loss, which is not why you're supposed to do it. But that was the first time where I was like, whoa, food actually affects a lot because a lot of my health issues eased. And so I shared a little bit about that on my blog, shared some Whole30 recipes, but it was this weird dance where, I'm publishing and sharing recipes, teaching people how to cook, and I'm changing and figuring out like how I do that in alignment. I definitely was doing things more like behind the scenes on a personal level before like bringing that to like the public space. And, after Whole30, I was trying to really, on a personal level, figure out my health issues. So I cycled through all sorts of iterations of paleo, keto, AIP, low carb Atkins, all sorts of things. And I'd say like, as I was experimenting, I didn't really share too much publicly because I didn't know what was going to stick or land. Like for example, when I did keto, it didn't go well for me. But by the time I came to carnivore, I just realized I needed to make a choice. And it's actually, I'm really glad for the experience that I've had working in that industry, because I've really gone through, like when I did the carnivore experiment, like kind of secretly, once I decided, oh my gosh, I'm going to do this, I kind of had to take a few months to myself and really, for my own integrity, do a lot of research, answer those environmental questions, the ethical questions, the health questions. And then I felt like comfortable, like, okay, I'm going to become like an advocate for this and really speak up for meat and for carnivore in my experience. But I basically have got to the point where it's kind of complete. It's time to leave it behind. It's been very much a struggle. I've cried because that business was my baby and I love food. I mean, I love food so much that I literally made it my career, but it's time.
So, do you think that you would go into, I mean, there's still a lot of like cooking things you can do with carnivore. I don't know if you do these like intricate menus with carnivore. I know there's some people that do that. I'm really simple. So I'll just cook a steak and eat the same thing over and over. I'm so boring. Do you feel that may have some of your calling? I know the mental health side is so important. And I applaud you for bringing that up, because I think there's a lot more that we need to speak about in the carnivore space on that. A lot of people come here for healing, like metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, diabetes. And then there's also weight loss, right? Like those are the big things why people come here and they change, and the autoimmune stuff. But there's not as much about the food addiction, because most people don't think they have a food addiction or a not so great relationship with food. And when we peel the layers and we remove carbs, most people realize, wow, I do have some type of relationship with carbohydrates. Do you see yourself like focusing on both, on recipes, on mental health?
I love so much that you said that most people don't realize they have food addiction, because I never thought I had anything like that. It just sounds so serious.
Yeah, right.
But the thing is, that kind of relationship with food, it's so normalized. We don't realize that actually like our food environment is completely insane. And, it's just, no one thinks anything. If like, I don't know, it's almost like a joke. If you're finishing your lunch and you're already thinking about dinner, like that's just normal. Like that's just, people obsess about food. But I think something that has been healing for me that I've realized through carnivore is that when you start understanding dopamine and you start understanding the nature of virtually every food that surrounds us, you realize it is absolutely laughable that we're going to be able to like control ourselves or like not always want more. Like the idea that we have breaks with some of these foods like cake or cookies or chips. And even, bringing this back to my blog and my work, like I wasn't making processed foods, but there was kind of this element of like, let me create like this outrageous recipe. And I understood like how to please the palate. You balance the sweet and the salty, and it's crunchy and it's creamy. And I didn't really realize it, but part of making food taste good is like, you're trying to really make something stimulating. And even though I do a little bit of cooking stuff, on my Instagram, it's like once your dopamine levels, like it gets to kind of like a more normal baseline, you're just happy with like a grilled piece of beef with salt. And, it's amazing to not have to peel and chop carrots or potatoes or any of that stuff anymore. Yeah. It's just very odd how it's happened. Like, I don't really have an interest in trying to make like meat, like fancy or stimulating. Cause it almost feels like one of the best parts of carnivore is that I'm free from that.
That's amazing. With your relationships from that period, I mean, even if you don't do it as a career, how did you share with some of the friends that you made in that period? Like, how do you share, hey, I'm now carnivore, I eat meat only. And let's say some of them have the eyeballs or the smirking. How do you deal with that in real life?
Oh my word. Well, it's extremely challenging. It's been very humbling. I think all I can do, like, I trust my story, even like something that I talk about in my podcast. Like, I came from the place where I believed that plants were the healthiest thing that we could eat. So I understand why, if people believe that. I mean, I am not judgmental of that, because then I'd be judging myself. I really thought that was the good thing to do. And I just stand behind my experience and also all that research I've done. I think it's so interesting. One of the most valuable things that Carnivore has taught me is that things need to be questioned. There are so many things that we are hearing all the time, and we hear it so much that we just accept it as true. And I don't even think that we realize it. And that has been so true of meat. There's all sorts of things like, meat causes cancer, or, just all these things they're false. So much of the environmental stuff drives me crazy. Like, I remember when I started looking into that and realizing this is a lie. This narrative is a lie. And like, just as an example, like I remember I looked at every single environmental criticism that I could find about animals. And one of my favorites was, this claim, a cow drinks a bathtub of water every single day. And it's like, okay, but like, first of all, it's not water coming out of the faucet. Right. It's not blue water. It's green water. Like almost all of the water a cow drinks is green water. It's rainwater that would be there regardless of whether the cow is there or not. And also, like, it's not like the water disappears in the cow. Like they arguably turn it into something more nutritious for the land, urine. So it's like, they're trying to like, make it seem like, oh, this horrible thing. They drink a bathtub of water. And it's like, what? Like, no, this is so misleading. There's so many angles like that. So I just really stand in the research I've done and my experience. And if people don't agree with it, that's fine. But I feel really at peace and good about the choices that I'm making from all those angles that I talked about earlier. Yeah. And I just like, sharing the stuff that I found and just doing so from a place of curiosity. And I don't feel the need to try to make anyone carnivore. Like if someone wants to eat plants, that's great. Do what you want with your life. Like I have no problem with that. Just don't try to tell me what I should eat. I don't like that.
Right. No, and that's a good place to start, right? So it's not dogma. It's just you're sharing what works for you, and you've done the science and research, and it makes full sense. When I was doing the same thing for Carnivore Cure, I found very similar things about the green water, blue water. And then it's just so funny. I also did research on the plant side, and it's like one almond requires 1.1 gallons, if not more, of water. And most of the almonds in the US are being made in California, in the most drought prone zone of all of California. So then there's also fees and costs of bringing the water there to produce almonds. And then on top of that, almost all almonds in America are pasteurized. So they go through this whole process that even makes them more toxic for us than if they were raw almonds. And raw almonds, I think if they're, tampered in some way, they can still be considered, even if they're pasteurized, they can still be considered raw. And it's all this deceit, but none of that gets airplay, right? It's all that the cows and the methane and all that. It's wild. One thing I want to ask you is, so I know you've been through this journey, like what makes you want to share? Is your healing so powerful that you want to just like shout it on the rooftops? What inspired you to do the podcast and now share? And obviously it's a good thing, but what made you...
Well, I had a lot of resistance to doing the podcast. It kind of took me a few months to be like, oh my gosh, am I going to do this? But I just felt so compelled. I wanted to share a fuller picture of the whole story. The narratives that we hear are so incredibly biased. And the thing that's so wild is when you start learning and digging into the history of just how much bias and so many shady, unethical shenanigans there are involved in so many aspects of food, you really realize, again, coming back to that, you really need to question things and look into things for yourself. Part of the podcast, was a result of like, I'd done all this research for myself. I'm going to share this with other people. And the way that I do it is they're kind of like 10 to 15 minute episodes, and they're very short. I look at like all the broad research on like a certain topic. So like an episode on gut health, one on environment, one on metabolic health, and why carnivore is so compelling for that angle of health. I've been told repeatedly, people like they don't have time to do the research. And so it's like, here's 15 minutes where you can learn all of the highlights of, the history of how fat became vilified, or, so-and-so thing, just so people can think and question. And something that I really push on my podcast is the idea that your body is really the ultimate authority. I'm not sure I would have ever, like, I always say that carnivore, it kind of forced me to believe something new. It's like, hey, your bleeding is gone in 3 days from eliminating plants. Like, you should probably reconsider your beliefs around plants versus meat. And I really think that the body does really speak to you. Yes. And what's beautiful about that is it's a great way to kind of put to rest the conflicting information that's out there, because literally, I mean, you take the extremes of carnivore and vegan, they're each saying the opposite thing. So how do you make sense of that? You see how you feel and you take it for a test run.
Yeah, I think even in the carnivore space, there's different opinions for different things, but ultimately I always try to give the power back to the people, because your body and the feedback it gives you is the strongest pulse of what's going on in the body. I mean, there's a test you could do for food sensitivities and even environmental sensitivities. You test your pulse. So you test your pulse without anything for 1 minute. You literally count every single pulse. And then you put a food on your tongue and let it just sit there for a few seconds. And then you test your pulse again. If your pulse goes up more than, I think it's 6 beats, there's a sign that your body is sensitive to that food. And then you could do that with environment. So you can go into, let's say you're outside and you test your pulse, and then you go inside a specific room. Let's say there's mold in that room or something. If your heart rate goes up a little bit, and we don't notice the difference of just 6 beats, but that's the telling part. We have so many mechanisms that we have been blessed with that tell us these things, but we have learned to ignore all of our signs. And so that's one way you can do it. But if someone's eating certain foods and they feel unwell, like they have bloat and they get eczema, we think these are so normal that, oh, we should just get a topical cream or get some type of medicine that relieves us from constipation and bloat. But these, while they're normal, they shouldn't be accepted as normal, because they're common, but they're not normal. And because we've normalized it so much, we accept that we're unwell, and it's just the standard care is okay that way. But the reality is it's just not healthy. And, like I always bring up the example of how when we eat rotten food or we smell it, we have that natural inclination to move away from that food. And so the more people try certain things, they will ultimately know what is working and what is not working for them.
Yeah, I love that. I couldn't have said that better. And I totally agree. It's crazy how much pain and health struggles have just become normalized and people accept them. And I have compassion for that, because I was told, you just have this disease and there's nothing you can do about it. One of the craziest things that happened with carnivore with me is I, for my whole life, had really bad gum disease, really severe bleeding, significant bone loss for my age. And I am very type A. My dental hygiene was flawless, like brushing twice a day, floss, medicated mouthwashes, like water pick, all sorts of things. And I just could never figure it out. And I remember I went to the dentist a few months after carnivore, and they did that thing where they like measured my gum pockets. And she's like, "What are you doing?" The screen was just full of green arrows. Everything had improved. There was no bleeding. She said she could literally see my old diseased gum tissue, like it had rolled away. And it's just so amazing how, I had been told, you have this gum disease. There's nothing you can do about it. You can, use this medicated mouthwash. And it's like, that went away when I removed the plants, like nothing. Same with the acid reflux. I tried so many things to do that. And it's amazing how much better it works to just get rid of the thing that's causing the problem.
Instead of finding all these alternate, right. The problem is that most people don't think it's the plants that are the issue. But, just talking a little bit about your journey. So how did you start? And then what, are you eating the same way that you did in the very beginning? I know you have family. Do they eat meat-based? How are you raising your kids in terms of diet?
Yeah. So I should preface this, I said earlier that I did a Whole30 4 years before. And so I didn't quite go straight from standard American diet to carnivore. But, even when I was doing paleo and keto, I was making a lot of those like keto cheesecake bars and like the fathead pizza that's like the crust is made with cheese and tomato sauce and topped with cheese. I was still indulging in like a quote unquote approved way. I would say in the beginning, I definitely had way more variety than I do now. I remember hearing someone say that the longer you go carnivore, the less you care about variety. And it's like, that's not going to be true for me. I love food. Like I'm going to, need all this variety. Now I just eat meat with salt, grilled meat with salt. Very much true. So, and, I'd really credit that with just your kind of your taste changing. It really does adjust. And I mean, I'm waiting for the day that I get tired of a grilled ribeye with salt. It's so great. And my family, my husband eats mostly carnivore. He is far more athletic than I am. And he eats some rice, which he feels like he tolerates well. He doesn't tolerate wheat. But rice seems to be okay. And mostly like he'll have like some fruit here or there. My kids They are meat heavy. What we do in my family is we serve kind of meat as the first course. So, I mean, for me, it's my only course, but the kids kind of know, like, let's fill up on steak. And then if they want something else, they can have some rice or fruit or whatever. But sometimes they just eat the steak. So they have some meals that are just fully carnivore and they're happy. But yeah, I mean, we limit things like sweets, like there's no sweets in the house. We can have that, the birthday party or something, that's fine. But so they're doing carnivore sometimes, meat heavy.
Yeah, I think my kids eat the same way. Because I come from a disordered eating place, I'm very mindful. I initially, when I went carnivore and keto, I was a full believer in that all plants are bad and we should limit and that no one should be eating them. And then I just came down from that, I guess, cloud nine, and realized that there has to be a balance a little bit with kids. They're not metabolically unhealthy like I am. They didn't have an eating disorder. And so when I saw my kids feel left out at a birthday party, that's when I realized I needed to loosen up a little bit, but in a way that still made sense. And so like you, we do meat first. So if there's rice and let's say meat, they eat the meat first and then they'll focus on some rice or they'll have some type of carb. And I'm a lot more open with them so that they don't ever feel like I've been restricted all my life. And I would hate for them to then go to college and go, time to binge, right? And that scares me. And so I'm very open with, if you want to have pizza one day, well, let's talk through it. And so sometimes they'll have pizza and noodles. And if there's like 1-2 consecutive days, my younger son gets eczema. And then that's how I point it out. Said, do you notice you're really itchy in that part of the arm? Because I grew up with a lot of eczema. And I say, well, it's likely because of what you've been eating. So your body is telling you that it doesn't like it. And so they're very aware. And so I hope that these little tidbits of information will carry over to when they decide to party and drink beer and pizza, then they don't feel good. That I'm hoping they'll be like, I remember mom said this was make me have eczema, right? And hopefully they'll eat a little bit less. And that's the goal. So I think it's smart what you're doing.
I want to affirm what you're doing there because I've kind of noticed the same thing with my kids. I kind of remembered in my own childhood, when I was younger, there were certain things that I was not allowed to eat that my brothers were allowed to eat, or, things were restricted. And I was doing all sorts of deranged behaviors. Like there was one time I was in the garage about to go out for a bike ride. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm alone. And I went to the freezer and started eating ice cream with my fingers. There was one time when I went to like a friend's house, she ate a box of Nilla wafers and I ate so many that like I threw up. Just all these things where the restriction kind of had, an equal, like maybe actually worse reaction on the other side. And I think what you're doing of, kind of letting them choose those foods, but being aware of what the consequences are, that's about as good as it can get, I can think, in terms of teaching them to just watch and know that we can make choices. But let's see what happens when you eat those things. And my kids also notice that they don't feel good or they have a tummy ache with certain foods. So I think that's amazing, or at least I'm a fan.
Well, thank you. And, it really helps because they'll ask me like, Mom, why can't you have some fruit, or why can't you have sugar, ice cream? And I mean, sometimes I'll have like a little spoon and go, see, I'm eating it. And so I show them that it's a choice, right? But I tell them like, mom was diabetic before, pre-diabetic, and I struggled with issues, and I'm very open, but obviously I don't tell it to the extent it was. And I say, so if I eat those things, I just am not well. And I want to be around as your mom for a long time. And so I can't eat those foods. And then the first time I told them that, anytime if I ever touched any type of sugar, they'd be like, no, you're not going to be around. So it's just, you have to be careful with the kids, but I'm very mindful because I'll get a lot of messages online. And when I show that their kids' meal has just meat, I get messages of like, I really feel bad for your children. I feel that they are not getting a child. Yes. And they don't know all of the context, but it's unfortunate because we are fueling them with what they should be eating for their brain, for their health. But of course, there's a balance of also letting them feel included in this world as well.
Yeah, I agree. And that's so much based on personal choice,
So do you feel like from the years of eating meat-based or meat only that you feel like true food freedom?
Well, yeah. So I mentioned earlier, I've been dieting since middle school. I can't think of how many notepads I must have used writing down macros and calories and maybe even more so than that, it just always felt like this heavy burden. It was always just what I thought about. Like, I need to control myself. This is too much. I need to reel it back. And carnivore is the only thing I've ever done where I don't pay attention to calories or macros. There's some disagreement about that. I don't believe in intuitive eating in general, because I think that there are a lot of super stimulating foods that hijack our system. I actually do believe in intuitive eating when you're eating things like meat with salt, meats that aren't too stimulating. And it has just been the most freeing thing to not have to track. It's very intuitive. There's such a lightness to that. And the thing that is so wild to me is that I kind of checked a few times. I am eating far more calories than I've ever eaten in my life. And I'm the leanest I've ever been. And it's just weird. I think back in the times when I was, eating 1,200 calories a day and running 6 miles, and somehow I'm eating all this meat and fat and I'm leaner. And I didn't do carnivore for weight loss. I did it for healing, but it is wonderful that I've kind of been given freedom from just that heavy, heavy burden of trying to manage food.
Right. No. And I agree with you. And that's so powerful. What would you say to the people, or, there's women that are maybe a little bit older and they've done the diet cycle, maybe double the time that you have. And for some people, when they do carnivore, they don't lose a lot of the weight. And so they're still kind of stuck in this cycle. Maybe they have lost some, but not all. Do you have any tips in terms of maybe helping them lose a little bit of the weight?
Well, something that I realized about like a year and a half in a carnivore is that there were times when I was having kind of like a snack and it would be a meat type things, like technically it was carnivore and it's allowed, but it was still like an emotional event. It was unnecessary food. There was one time I was in the car and my kids were eating these snacks and I was like, oh, I really want that, but I don't really want that. I guess I'll eat a meat stick, but I wasn't actually hungry. I think sometimes there's a little bit to be tweaked in terms of that. But something that's interesting is there's a lot of discussion and also some controversy about the idea of more fat versus protein sparing modified fasting. It seems that people differ a little bit in terms of how much fat versus protein they need. You could probably speak to this better than I can, but I think there's a lot of personal experimentation to be done. So there's probably just some sort of change that they need to make. And man, don't you just wish you just get to the perfect place? But sometimes there's a little bit of tweaking involved.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. I think everyone's going to be different. Some people do better with higher fat. I think most people do better with moderate fat. I'm not the biggest fan of protein sparing modified fast, but I can be completely biased just because I came from an eating disorder, and any sign of cravings, something that triggers me to be still going in the pantry. And I've literally done just one day of protein sparing, or half a day. And I noticed it. So I ate chicken breast. I wasn't satiated. I felt hungry. It wasn't. And so I noticed I wanted a beef stick. And so that was my trigger of, okay, this is not going to work for me. I'm sure people would say, well, Judy has to do it longer and then she'll know the benefits. But again, I didn't do this for weight loss. This was for my mental health. This was for me to heal from an eating disorder. And that level of freedom, which I never thought I'd be free from an eating disorder, is more than okay for me to have a few extra pounds that maybe I could have lost by using these levers. But I'm older. I have kids. That's not a big why for me. And so I think people have to figure that out for themselves. I think when you're younger, it's hard to say, it's okay that you have a little bit of fat on your body. Some people are like, no, I want to be stick skinny. And if that's your goal, which is not my goal anymore, and then it's different. Right. And so that's where it becomes very individualized. And I do think if you want to be ultra thin, have a 6-pack, you have to sacrifice certain things. It might be your hormone health. It might be your sleep, but what value is that to you? And that's where people have to take a hard look within themselves. When I was younger, I was okay not sleeping well because I wanted to be ultra thin, and that is not a value of mine anymore. And so people just have to be really honest with themselves. But I think women naturally have a little bit more fat on their body because we carry our extra hormones there, so that in periods of strife and limited food, we can care for our children. And so when we are trying to look like men with these 6-packs, I don't think it's normal. But again, people can do that, and they just got to figure out, maybe some people are genetically blessed that they can look like that and not have any issues. Like I've never been like that. So, I think it really depends.
I agree. And I had the same response, by the way, with the protein sparing modified fasting. It made me very rebellious because it kind of brought me back to that like restriction diet mentality, and it kind of backfired. So yeah, there's so many personal considerations to take into account.
Yeah, I agree. So where can people find you, your podcast? I will say that I have received a lot of messages about your podcast, that it's good that, like you said, it's very short bits of information. So when people are stimulated by so many things, they're busy all the time, they have so much information to look into, but these short bite-sized pieces of specific content is very helpful. And there have been people in the community that have said that your information is helpful. So thank you for that. But, where can people find your podcast, and where can people find you? Do you work with people? Where can people find you?
Yeah. So, theroadtocarnivore.com, you can stream the podcast there or on any of the podcast, kind of the mainstream podcast players, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, all of that. I'm also on Instagram, The Road to Carnivore, there as well. I was doing one-on-one coaching, but I am actually winding that down, and I'm working on a carnivore course that I'm very excited about. I don't want to qualify it too much, but I feel like it's almost a philosophy course. Like it's kind of a lot of the deep ideas and thinking that I had to change in order to get to the place where I freely choose this. And I'm not doing this by like brute force or willpower or any of that stuff. It's basically all the mental pieces that you need to shift in order to keep doing this, not from a place of like have to, but with freedom. And definitely for people who tend to be like me and had an attachment to food or can't imagine doing something like this. So yeah, that's kind of what's in the works for right now. But yeah, keeping it concise. I'll do some more podcast episodes soon, but just pushing that meat on those platforms.
That's good. And thank you so much. I think that's really good. I really think a lot of eating this way is freedom, but I know from the outside, it's the first thing they say is it's so restrictive. But if they walked the diet for a good amount of months, there is this level of Zen that you will never experience unless you've been through it. And I think both of us have experienced our darker days eating plants and struggling and using food as emotions. But without all of that, you don't realize how much more you can live and have freedom. And so I think that's where we become such strong advocates. So I applaud you for sharing.
Thank you. I mean, that's what I love about my story is, what I'm saying basically is that the health that you get from carnivore is so compelling that this person who is obsessed with food as my everything was willing to give all that up. I remember I had an econ professor in college who came in. He's like, I wish I could take like a 2,000 calorie pill every day so I didn't have to worry about my meals. And I'm like, I do not relate to you at all. And like, I was thinking about him the other day because I was like, I bet carnivore would be really easy for someone like that. But I think a lot of people really love food, even still, I think a lot of people haven't experienced true health, and carnivore can give that to you. And you might decide that that's worth doing this.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah. Thank you, Judy. This is fun.
Okay, guys, I hope that this interview was really motivating and inspiring. When people heal, we just want to do different things and serve in a different way. Make sure to check out Joanne's podcast. It's very short, bite-sized pieces that can be very helpful for someone, especially if they're brand new to carnivore. I hope that this interview was inspiring for you to stick to meat only long-term so that you can find the benefits that we have found in this way of eating. All right, guys, make sure to eat a lot of meat. Take care of your bodies because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you guys later. Bye.